What if I told you about a single week in the near future? A week so packed with chaos, it feels like an entire year. Well, according to historian Cox Richardson, a week just like that might not just be a series of random crises. It could be the explosive final act of a political era that has shaped America for 45 years.
So the week kicks off with just tragedy on top of tragedy. A weekend of horrific mass shootings is followed by the news that filmmaker Rob Reiner and his wife have died. But instead of a moment of national unity or mourning, the White House's response is a social media post, an unbelievably controversial post that sets off an immediate firestorm from both sides of the aisle.
And while things look chaotic from the outside, a bombshell report from Vanity Fair reveals it's even crazier on the inside. The story is based on secret recordings of the chief of staff, and it paints a picture of a completely dysfunctional administration, run by what the source calls radical zealots making massive decisions pretty much on a whim.
At the same time, over on Capitol Hill, you can feel the ground starting to shift. The Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, tries to block a vote on extending healthcare tax credits. But he gets openly challenged by a group of his own Republicans who team up with Democrats to force his hand. It's this public display of weakness that shows his grip on power is seriously slipping.
And just when you think nothing else could possibly happen, the past comes roaring back. Former special counsel Jack Smith testifies before Congress, and he drops a legal bombshell. He states, in no uncertain terms, that his investigation uncovered proof beyond a reasonable doubt of a criminal scheme to overturn the 2020 election.
The week finally closes with a hastily called presidential speech, a speech that observers described as an unnerving display of fear. So you have to ask yourself, right? Is this just a random, terrible week? Or are all these different events, the scandals, the political infighting, the legal drama, are they all connected?
And that leads us to the central argument of the source material. This week of turmoil isn't random at all. Instead, it's the chaotic, messy, and violent end of a political movement that has defined American politics for more than 4 decades, the Reagan Revolution.
Okay, but to really get why this era might be ending in such an explosive way, we have to rewind. We need to understand what the Reagan Revolution actually was, and, more importantly, what it promised the American people.
Yeah, at its heart, the Reagan Revolution was built on a really simple and powerful idea, that government was the problem. The theory went that if you just cut taxes, especially for businesses, and slashed regulations, you'd unleash this incredible way of economic growth, and that new wealth, it would trickle down and make life better for everyone.
So that was the promise, prosperity for all. But the reality, at least according to this analysis, turned out to be, well, pretty different. Instead of wealth trickling down, it seems it flowed up. Income inequality grew massively, with a huge portion of the country's new wealth getting captured by the top 1%.
And if you want to put a number on that economic shift, it is absolutely staggering. The source points to a study by the Rand Corporation that calculated this figure, $80 trillion. That is how much more money the bottom 90% of Americans would have in their pockets today if the economic system we had before 1975 had just stayed in place.
So what happens when the promises of a political idea just don't come true? Well, according to this source, the people in power don't just give up on the idea, they double down, pushing it to its most extreme logical conclusion, moving from a political belief system into something that looks a lot like lawlessness. Just look at foreign policy. The source highlights this jaw-dropping quote from an unnamed government official about the decision to attack boats from Venezuela. He says, "When you hope and wait for something to develop that doesn't, you start looking at countries south of Mexico." It suggests the attack wasn't about security. It was because they needed a quick win and another plan wasn't panning out.
So how do you sell that to the public? Well, the official justification, voiced by senior advisor Stephen Miller, was this. Its tyrannical expropriation was the largest recorded theft of American wealth and property. The source interprets this as creating a story, a justification for seizing Venezuela's oil.
And this kind of shift in language wasn't a one-time thing. After retaliatory strikes in Syria, the defense secretary actually said, "This is not the beginning of a war, it is a declaration of vengeance." The source points to this as a huge shift where foreign policy stops being about strategy and starts being about personal revenge.
And this defiance wasn't just happening overseas. Back home, the source describes actions that seem to just flat-out ignore the law. The Kennedy Center's board votes to rename it, an act that is illegal without congressional approval. And when a new law demands the full release of the Jeffrey Epstein files, the Department of Justice puts out documents so heavily blacked out that a Republican congressman said it grossly fails to comply with the law.
But here's where things get really fascinating.
As the administration seems to act with more and more defiance, the very political movement that brought it to power, it starts to fracture from the inside.
First, you start to see key allies making for the exits. Senator Cynthia Lummis of Wyoming announces she's not running again. Then, in an even bigger shock, Representative Elise Stefanik, a staunch ally, doesn't just drop her campaign for governor of New York, she says she's leaving the House for good.
But maybe the biggest crack in the entire ideology comes from a really unlikely place: Mitt Romney, the Republican Party's presidential nominee back in 2012. He writes an op-ed in the New York Times calling to fix economic inequality by raising taxes on the rich, on people like himself. As author Cox Richardson notes, this is a complete 180, a clear signal from a party elder that the core beliefs of the Reagan Revolution have failed.
So this all brings us back to one final huge question. If this 1 week of chaos really is the end of a 45-year political era, an era whose promises of prosperity unraveled into defiance and fear, then what on earth is supposed to come next?